Hey, welcome to Perspectives. This is a podcast where we talk about some current issues and try to bring a Christian biblical perspective to bear on them. And today I'm joined by Brady Randall, who leads our Butler campus at Orchard Hill. Welcome.
Good to be here.
And we are going to talk about boycotts, and especially how boycotts work from a Christian perspective. And part of what's driving this today is, on the day we're recording this, in the news, there is a lot of talk about Bud Light and how it's being tanked because people aren't buying Bud Light after a whole deal there. And then Target and Kohl's, people are talking about it, and there's a lot of should talk from some places about, if you're a person of faith, that you should jump on board with these boycotts. So we want to talk about that, but first let me start with this, Brady. When do you first remember hearing about Christians boycotting something, and was your perception of it positive or negative?
Probably, I mean, this is going back to, 50s or 60s with the Montgomery bus boycott with Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. Mm-hmm. So kind of growing up in school, that's where boycotting was kind of effective. So I think that's probably my first recollection.
So you remember hearing about that?
Yes.
Because I don't think you were alive in the 50s?
Not yet. I was maybe a pure thought, but no. That's when I remember first hearing about that in terms of that.
Okay, and what about personally? When was the first time that it wasn't academic or a historic question for you?
Well, I'd rather go to my most recent.
Okay.
But so I'm not a big beer drinker.
Right.
But my light beer of choice would be Michelob Ultra. And anyway, I was golfing last week with my friends. Very leaning one way, and one of them happened to have a Busch Light, which evidently was a Busch Light Apple, which was discontinued last year, but somehow they had a big case of it. So I was drinking that. They said, "What are you doing drinking that?" They're very much for the Bud Light boycott. I said, "This is Busch Light." They said, "It's part of Anheuser-Busch." I said, "Well, what about Ultra?" "Well, that's part of Anheuser-Busch." And so I was getting kind of roasted on the golf course for a beer of choice over what they were boycotting, more in a fun kind of way, but it was like, what are you doing drinking that? Mm-hmm. So that was kind of the most recent example. I remember several years ago there was the talking about Target as well with the transgender bathrooms. That was kind of a big thing like 5-6 years ago. So those are kind of on my most recent radar when I was pressured to join others in boycotting, I would say. Yeah,
so it's interesting, and the reason I asked the historical question is sometimes in a moment of time, like we're in right now, where people are talking about boycotts and everything, it's easy to become isolated to that moment, and I think it's helpful to step back, and so to think about good boycotts, such as the Rosa Parks or the busing and that, and say there have been positive impacts that boycotts can make where people for good, and like this Bud Light one seems almost good-natured fun to me, where it's just this spontaneous thing of, what are you doing drinking a Bud Light? I'm not much of a beer drinker either, so for me, I don't know that I have had a Bud Light in, I don't remember the last time I had a Bud Light anyway, so it's not really any active boycott, but I understand why people would say that and seems good-natured. Target, I get it too, but it's also an interesting idea there, and part of the issue it raises is where do you stop? Because something like Anheuser-Busch, if you're going to be consistent, you're going to boycott all kinds of things, and I think that raises a question. And so my initial, and the reason I asked the historical question is, I remember as a kid, Christian groups wanting to boycott things and always feeling like it was an unnecessary, almost legalistic, you should join this, and if you don't, you're not much of a Christian type of a mindset, and almost being repelled by it. And then having the thought process of consistency. So probably for me, a bigger issue is investing. Where do you put your money? And if you're in the stock market at all, are you investing in companies that are using fair wages, that are expressing values, or are you just simply throwing money? And then again, how far do you go? and what makes something worthy of saying, yes, I'll step out of that. So that's really the question I'd like to ask you, Brady, is how would you, if somebody said to you, how should I go about deciding whether or not to support something financially versus not? What are the criteria that you would encourage somebody to think through?
I think the main thing would be, what is your ultimate goal? Is your ultimate goal that by my boycotting, I'm going to put this company out of business? Good luck with that, depending on how many billions the company has behind them. Or is your goal ultimately to win people who disagree with you toward your worldview? Because if that's your goal, then I'm not sure. I see a lot of social media right now, certain friends kind of railing against, let's say, Target in particular. And I understand where they're coming from and the issues that they raise. But if their goal is to convert their friends or people who don't share that same worldview, I see that as being a zero effective way to do that. In fact, I think they're closing off dialogue by "you must," and this is what I'm going to do in such a vociferous tone that I don't see how that's having an effect to continue the dialogue.
What's interesting today, and maybe this is again just history, it felt to me like a lot of the boycotts Christians tried to put forward in the past felt like people trying to almost create an issue. Now I understand, for example, with the Target saying, if you're going to sell bathing suits with, tuck things and stuff like that, we're just going to choose to spend our money elsewhere as a way to say, you chose that, I'm choosing this. I understand that thinking probably more than I have in the past with some of the called for boycotts. I do think there's a choice of where to spend money. And something like Bud Light, where if you do walk into a beer store and buy beer, it's, do I want this one or this one? It's a single line product. It's a pretty easy choice to say. Whereas a retailer that you utilize, is Amazon. Is it better if you're buying a product from Amazon rather than Target with some of the same things that Amazon promotes than it is otherwise? And so that's where I say there's a consistency issue that becomes problematic, because are you really doing anything better by going to Walmart instead of Target? And then you should at least vet that out if that's really what you're trying to do, in my mind.
And I don't know how you can truly be consistent. And
Right.
let's say we've not come down where we personally stand yet, but let's say you are socially on the right side. By right, I mean right versus left. And I mean, then how do you line Jeff Bezos' pockets? How do you buy Nike shoes? How do you certain oil companies fund Planned Parenthood? And if you're against that, how do you vet which gas stations you're going to? Walmart, different practices for employees, and so how do you shop anywhere with any consistency?
Right.
I don't know how you do that without leaving let's be your self-sufficient farmer or something like that.
Right. So one of the arguments I've heard people put forward is, yes, okay, you can't stop everything and oppose everything, but you can make an example of some who go so hard into the culture battle and aggressively promote it into your world. So, for example, they would say Target has been so aggressive, so let's make an example of Target by simply anybody who is on the other side of that issue, don't shop at Target, is the thought process. What would you say to that?
One of the things that I've seen that why there's such an upheaval against Target in particular is, and this is what others would say, but that there's a targeting of children with that particular agenda that is so egregious in some people's mind that that's one of the tipping points. And I think if your thought was protecting your own children and how can our children be exposed to this the first time they walk in and this is what they're getting, if your goal is really to reach your own children and other children, would maybe a better way to do that be to take your own child into Target to have a conversation about what they see and why. Like, to me, that opens better
Those two
dialogue.
aren't mutually exclusive, though.
Okay.
in other words, you could still have that conversation with your children and then say, but we're not going to shop here or spend much money here.
Well, you mentioned
as a
one of the
result.
pieces of clothing. Like it's one thing it's like to see it maybe more visually
Right.
stimulating
Right.
or visually.
All I'm saying is it's not mutually exclusive to say I'm going
Yeah,
to protect
sure.
my child and choose to, not buy Bud Light or whatever that is.
But my question would be is if you take that, and I agree, you can choose to take your money elsewhere, right? But my question would be, is that the most, to be vocal about? It's one thing if Kurt says, hey, I'm just going to choose in my own moral convictions to shop here instead of there. I'm not putting my money towards that. But if you're, and then the other step is then I'm going to post that on social media, what Kurt, am going to do because of this. Well, that may be fine, but how are you going to reach 50% of your other contacts in
Well, you're not reaching.
Yeah.
At that point, what you're doing is you're virtue signaling, which means what you're doing is you're simply saying, I'm choosing this and I want to identify with a group who boycotts, just like there's groups who can boycott on the other side. What was a few years ago, people were boycotting Chick-fil-A. And then people did the anti-boycott where they said, let's all go to Chick-fil-A because of the people who are boycotting Chick-fil-A.
And now did you hear they're also boycotting Chick-fil-A?
Now again, because they have a DEI initiative. Yeah, I did hear that. And again, that's where you hit the, okay, what are you going to oppose? So here would be my takeaway, and I want to hear your take on what the Bible says about boycotting ultimately. My quick conversation or take would be to say, it's one thing to say I'm not going to spend my personal money or I'm going to choose how I spend my money. And I do think there's a moral component to that says, as I'm spending money, I have some responsibility to think about the labor practices, the agendas of those companies. However, I do think it's impossible to be completely consistent. So, for example, let's say somebody was in the market for a diamond. Okay. We know now, which we maybe didn't know as much 30 years ago, that a lot of diamonds are procured with horrible conditions, blood money, blood diamond, all that idea. Okay, does that mean you shouldn't buy a diamond? Does it mean that you need to try to say, is this ethically sourced? It raises some questions. So I think there's a personal moral obligation to say, I have some responsibility, and I say some in that, again, I think it's impossible to push all the way through. I think that's a different question than should I participate in an organized boycott. What's interesting about Bud Light to me is that seems like a spontaneous, non-organized reaction where people just said, you know what, I'm not reaching for Bud Light because I was offended by the sponsors that you picked. That feels different than even the current other boycotts like the Chick-fil-A or something where people are almost trying to go in and find something and then say, oh, let's do this. So what is the biblical thought process on boycotts? As you understand Scripture, where would you say there's any instruction for us to understand and bring a Christian perspective to thinking about boycotts?
Yeah, I think one area in particular would be Romans 14, which talks about disputable matters, what some things that Christians could potentially disagree on. One of the examples is on the Sabbath. Some choose the Sabbath, some different festivals, new moons. And what Paul says there is each one should be fully convinced in your own mind. So there's a matter of your own personal conscience in that. So be fully convinced in your own mind, I'm not going to do blood diamond money. I'm not going to Target or Bud Light if those are your issues. So I think that's one. The other thing is I've heard it said, better to light a candle than curse the darkness. In other words, it's really easy to rail against what you think culture is like, this is awful, this is wicked. And people get so jacked up about that, but what good is that really doing? I mean, why should we be surprised that there's evil agendas, that's Satan who's the father of lies, that the culture is the way it is? Why should we rail against the culture when why would it be any different? So that's to me where I have a big disconnect with louder Christians. By louder, I mean maybe social media or getting fired up. Like there's just an anger at the culture, but the culture is what it is.
Right.
That's where I'm confused.
So I would say I don't think the Bible addresses boycotts. Just as I've looked at it, I don't think you can say, oh, here's boycotts in the Bible. So that means there's not really a should or shouldn't. So I like your question of, and I think it's the same question I was asking, is what does your own moral compass say about engagement? But I don't think you need to be compelled by other people's shoulds or should nots. So if you want to eat at Chick-fil-A, shop at Target, I don't think that's you're somehow not honoring Christ because other people are calling for a boycott, especially because there's so many potential boycotts. You could find something wrong with just about any company and say, oh, here's something I think is ethically, morally poor, therefore don't. And it would be, again, hard to be consistent. And so I do think there's a personal choice. However, I feel like this current cultural touch point on some of the agendas around transgenderism is maybe a little different than past boycott issues. And the reason I say that is because past boycott issues were usually like, I just don't like how this is. So, okay, well, your family doesn't want to go to Disney. Okay, don't go to Disney. That's your choice. That's your ethical choice. But there is a new tipping point, and it is around the indoctrination of children. It is around the aggression of it. And so there does seem to me to be some wisdom to saying if there's a way to show solidarity and pushback on that issue, that is not altogether unnecessary. And so now what those are, I'm not entirely sure in terms of where that should go, but I am more aware of that than I think I have been in the past. Even when Pride Month started, June has always been known as Pride Month. It was like, okay, you know what? People want to have a parade to celebrate what they're doing. Okay, what difference does that make to me? But now Pride Month has become a lot of corporate virtue signaling, and almost if a company doesn't put a flag with all of the additional things in that, somehow it's almost gone the other way, where people say, I have to show allegiance to. And it almost has started to feel like a cult of religion in itself, a secular religion that says you must, for the month of June, bow your knee to and worship this new agenda, this new set of morality. And so for people to say, you know what, if a company decides to throw down hard on that and we want to push back the other way with our dollars as a way to say, you throw down on that, we're going to shop somewhere that doesn't. And I think that's what happened with Bud Light, is Bud Light, chose a really well-known, trans individual as a spokesperson and then kind of tried to act like they didn't. But they did choose that person, put that person forward. And even if you look at the history of that person, that didn't seem to be the same gender dysphoria that is something to say, okay, how do we live with compassion, and that it was definitely more agenda driven. And then people just said, okay, I'm out on Bud Light. And if Bud Light suffers, oh well. Now again, the challenge is Budweiser makes so many things that, but for me, that's not a big sacrifice. I don't think I drink any of those products. Beer isn't my thing, so it's kind of whatever. I wasn't drinking Bud Light to start with. So, but if I were at a game and I were about to have a beer and I had a choice between a Bud Light and a different product right now, I'd probably choose a different product just because of what's happened and saying, hey, you know what? I don't want to support that and that. So.
But isn't that a difference between Kurt saying that's where I'm going to choose versus Kurt then advocating others to join?
Well,
and when would you ever advocate others to join?
That's a great question. So I think what I'm saying is, so two parts to that answer. As Kurt and as Pastor Kurt of Orchard Hill, I think those are two different answers. As a pastor, I don't feel like as the church Orchard Hill, we want to be known for what we're against and that we want to be promoting boycotts. Because I feel like when somebody walks through the door, if the first thing they hear is, oh, you know what, we're anti-Bud Light. Well, if somebody's on the other side of that agenda,
Yes.
they don't even hear the gospel.
That's right.
And so as a church, I don't see that being what we're about. Now, as an individual, now because of the role I'm in, I realize, it's part of why I'm not on social media. I don't want to have to like stuff or not like stuff and have people read into it and be like, why didn't you like that post? And all of that. But I feel like to say, you know what, there's a time for people to say, we're not going to spend money on people who are actively promoting agendas that we disagree with. But what those things are, again, I think are up to people to decide, and I don't feel the need to advocate. I think people are aware of issues and smart and can make a whole lot of decisions around that. But yes, as a church, that's why we have never gotten on the boycott bandwagon and don't really intend to.
I guess my concern is talking about the engagement on this issue, because there may be people listening today who, and again, I don't know that Kurt and Brady have said where we are going to boycott, so we haven't come down on an issue.
So where are you going to boycott?
Well, hold up on that, Kurt.
Okay. I asked you first. You can't turn it around now.
Where I have a concern for the Christian church is their loud-natured, I am against this, because I don't see how that opens a door for dialogue. Let's say you've got 1,000 people on Facebook and 500 are with you. We're going to boycott Target, Bud Light. They're going after our children. These people are wicked, right? The whole thing's wicked. Well, how is that going to open a dialogue? Let's say the 500 people who are against you, you would say they are not Christians, but you desire for them to share that same worldview. Let's just say that's where you are. I don't see how that vociferous post and that engagement does anything other than shut the door for dialogue for those other 500 people. That's a concern I have with people who are fired up about issues.
So to play devil's advocate to
Yeah.
that, what I think somebody would say, who takes a different position, is, so as a church or as a culture, as a Christian, you're just going to sit back and not speak into an issue because you want to be open for dialogue, as opposed to saying we stand against something that is actively targeting kids, confusing kids on God-given gender, leading to transition surgeries, so on and so forth. So you're just choosing to stay out of the fray.
I would say maybe it's the platform. I've seen very little conversions on social media for someone's like, oh, I was here, but because of your loud, vociferous post, I just changed.
Right.
As opposed to a dialogue like this.
So I've gotten off social media, so I haven't been on for several years now. One of the better decisions I've made in terms of just my own headspace and soul, because I rarely found it good for my soul to be on social media. And so maybe I'm missing the social media component of this right now because I have stepped off of that platform. Generally, social media is not a positive place for these conversations. What that generally is virtue signaling. What you're doing is you're signaling to the people that already agree with you, I'm with you and I'm in this group. And I would agree that's generally not helpful. However, I do think there's some benefit to saying what has happened, I think, and this will sound like a left-right thing, and I think the church is teetering on this, and churches like Orchard Hill that have tried to stay apolitical, meaning we've tried not to be left or right. But there are some issues that both to the left and the right are biblical issues where you can't be apolitical as a church. And I do think transgenderism is one of those issues. But what's happened is people on the left have counted on the deference and silence and almost kind of the attitude you're talking about. Let's not make a deal of this. Let's be open to dialogue. And what's happened is the whole thing has swung. So take something like the pronouns, use of pronouns. So, a few years ago, the idea of pronouns comes out. Okay, I have my pronouns. Will you use my pronouns? Will you refer to me as my pronouns? My thing is I want my own adjectives. I want to be tall, handsome, and smart. And so I want you to always refer to me as handsome and smart. And it's obviously funny. Yeah, thank you. What was it Josh said earlier? Brady, you look good. Kurt, you're okay.
Not terrible.
For here. Not terrible, something like that. So at first it was, okay, you know what? I can be cordial, and if that helps you, and I thought, okay, this is kind of, I can see both sides. I can see people saying, I don't want to use pronouns because I'm not agreeing with truth. And I could see people saying, I'm going to be hospitable. I'm going to choose to use pronouns because it's a way of communicating with people that I value them, even if I don't necessarily agree with them. But now what's happening is if you don't use the pronouns, it's considered misgendering, and it's moved from a hospitable thing to a hostile thing. And part of where that's come from is this idea of well, I'm not going to take a stand on this and everything else. And so what it feels like to me, and this isn't necessarily around boycotts, but what it feels like to me is there are a few issues where there is no neutrality, and because neutral is seen as accommodating, and again, that's a harder line, but I think that we are climbing up into that even with some of these boycott kinds of issues. Although I would still say I don't think anyone's compelled to boycott, but I do feel like there are issues where what people are feeling is if we don't take a stand somewhere here, then we just keep ceding and ceding and ceding ground on this issue. And so again, Pride Month has gone from something that was, okay, we want to celebrate diversity and some of the ideas that people have, and whether you agree with it or not, okay, to a very aggressive agenda. I mean, what was it in the ballpark? The Dodgers. Do you remember this? You're a baseball fan. What was the deal there?
Indulgence or sisters was like of nuns, like dressing up as nuns, and
and then a couple ball players came out against it, and that one seemed okay. But then the guy in Toronto who came out, and then he had a backtrack, or he was going to get caught. Again, the aggression of it, where if you just simply say anything, is different than it was 15 years ago when boycotts were around.
And I would just say taking a stand, yes, is different than it's how you take your stand.
Agreed.
That would be my concern. Again, the concern is that your fired upness is not necessarily winning the people you want to convert.
Right. All right, so where are you? Boycotts. You said we haven't taken our position.
Here's where I am.
Begging the question.
And I'm a very, as you probably know, Kurt, I can be a little pharisaical, and I don't want to be inconsistent. So I've not said I'm not going to shop at a certain store, because I've also, the other biblical perspective, I'm going to be a steward of my resources and my time. And I've got some stores that are very close to me that I can get in and get out and do different products, and I know I can't be consistent. So I'm still going to be on Amazon. Anyway, I've not said there's a couple things I will choose not to buy, but I've not yet come down and say I am never again going into such and such store. That because I also value my time and my resource and convenience.
So it's not important enough to you yet to push that.
Yes, and that's a whole nother, yes, that's a fair, yes. It's important, but to me, if I were to, and this is actually a true thing, if I were to come out and say, I, Brady, am never going to Target again, well, I could come to that.
Right.
But I think that would be, that I would lose some opportunities with that stance to publicly say that with some people that so for me, that, I don't think for me personally, that would ultimately advance my goal, if that makes sense.
Right. So I would say, like as I said, I don't really drink Bud Light anyway, so that's, with a current issue, not really one. If I had a choice today and I was to have a beer, I'd probably choose something else, just to say I'm throwing my money a different direction. And I feel a little bit that way with Target, but I'm with you. I wouldn't make a grand statement that I'm never going to. But if I were about to drive out and shop somewhere today, I might think about saying, is there somewhere that I can also go to get the same product? But no hard line from me. But I feel like anytime you spend money, that question should be part of your question.
Sure.
And that is, and this isn't new, by the way. This is, some people would say, well, on the trans issue, it's an issue. If somebody's still watching who, holds a different viewpoint, there is, from Orchard Hill, from me, from Brady, there is compassion toward people who have gender dysphoria, who are legitimately struggling with this. I think it's the aggression of the agenda, not the individual, that's concerning. I would say, ultimately, it's easy when you think about some issues. That's why I brought up the diamonds, or you brought up the busing, to say, yeah, of course there are moral choices that are engaged with how we spend money. Everybody gets that. And so I would simply say, for me, the issue is it's a reminder to take a step back and say, how am I spending money? Am I spending it as ethically as possible? And I use the phrase as possible, and probably not even as ethically as possible. Am I using it responsibly? Meaning as where there's egregious things, am I trying to be somewhat consistent and say, I don't want to endorse products, companies that are hostile to or aggressive against things that I hold to be for human flourishing and for the gospel. And so if I can make a choice there, then I will.
Yep.
But that's really where
I just wanted to read a quick quote, because in this whole discussion, this is from a professor named Alan Noble. I just thought this was well put. He said, there will be times when faithful Christians must boycott businesses that are fundamentally unjust, when winsome persuasion is secondary to immediate justice. But for many cultural battles that face us today, this is not the case. Rallying your friends on social media to boycott, for example, Target, is less likely to produce the lasting change you want and more likely to alienate your friends who are open to discussing biblical teachings on sex and gender. And we discussed that, but I just thought that was generally a well-said sentence related to this topic.
Good. Any last words? Anything else
I'll
you
give
want
it
to say
to you,
about
Kurt.
that? I've said what I have to say. So,
jumping in, I thought I needed to say this in a way of defining my own lines of defense. I will never enter a store that uses papyrus font in their branding and their logo. That's cheap and easy and so lazy. So thank you, Edible Arrangements, for updating your branding so that I can eat your fruit again. Thanks.
that is the last word. Josh Thomas, usually behind the camera, in front of the camera today. May not be his last appearance. So thanks for being a part of Perspectives. Have a great week.